Magento uses PHP interfaces a lot in order to decouple code that uses some functionality from the implementation details. Interfaces and the related dependency inversion principle will be discussed in more detail in a future video. For now, we will focus on how to use the Object Manager with PHP interfaces. Often, instead of a concrete class, an interface is requested as a constructor argument type from the Object Manager. For example, let's assume we are writing a class that needs to synchronize customers with an external system. Maybe this customer synchronization stub class here. To build the functionality, this class needs access to customer data. For this, it needs an instance of the customer repository. If we look at the class definition for the customer repository, we can see that it implements a customer repository interface. The important thing about interfaces is that there can be more than one implementation of any interface. Now, if our class here depended on the customer repository interface, it might be possible to use our class with a different implementation of the interface too. The alternative implementation could be provided by a third-party module, or for testing purposes, or we could write an alternative implementation ourselves. It's maybe something that hooks Magento into an external system directly. But when an instance of an interface is required as a dependency, how does the Object Manager decide which implementation to use? Well, that is determined in the Object Manager di.xml configuration. But before we have a look at how to configure the implementation to use for a given interface, let's try instantiating a customer repository interface in the REPL with the Object Manager and without, just to see in more detail how it works. So I'll copy a reference to the customer repository interface. And let's start the REPL. And just for completeness, I first want to instantiate the interface directly with PHP. Of course, this fails. We get an error, class not found. Because indeed, the class doesn't exist since it's an interface. Yep. So now let's go ahead and ask the Object Manager to create an instance of the interface. Okay, so asking the Object Manager for an instance of the customer repository interface returns a customer repository instance. But what about shared instances? Let's use Object Manager get with the interface and with the class and check if they return the same instance for both. So first, I want to create an instance of the interface and assign it to a variable. And I want to use the get method. And now I'll copy the class name of the customer repository. And use the Object Manager to instantiate that too with get. And now I want to compare the two. And indeed, that's the same. So from this we can determine with a pretty high probability that the interface is first resolved to a class name, and then the shared instance is returned based on the PHP class. Now, let's have a look at the configuration that maps the customer repository interface to the customer repository. For this, I want to search within the customer module, vendor Magento module customer here. I want to search for the string customer repository interface within di.xml files. And there we have it. I added a new line around this declaration to make it easier to see what I'm talking about. So here we have a preference node for Magento Customer API, Customer Repository Interface. And then the mapping is declared with the type attribute Magento Customer Model, Resource Model, Customer Repository. Every interface that is required as a dependency of a class needs to be mapped to a preferred implementation. So what happens if there is no mapping? Well, let's try it out. Here in this example module, I have an interface, just a little dummy example interface, and a class that implements that example interface. Currently, no preference is configured. Let's first try to instantiate the example class, and then we'll also try to instantiate the example interface and see what happens. Okay, instantiating the class works. Now let's try to instantiate the interface. And no surprise, we get an error. Cannot instantiate interface. Well, quite correct. Now let's configure the preference, and for this we need to create an etc.di.xml file. So I'm using the file template, and now I'll declare a preference. And as the for attribute value, I'll use the interface. And for the type attribute value, I'll use the class name. And then I'll also remove the leading backslashes because they are always declared in global scope, and now we're consistent with how the core configures these things. They always remove the leading backslash too. Okay, let's flush the cache and try again. And now it works. To summarize, every interface needs to be mapped to a class, so the Object Manager can resolve dependencies on the interface. The mapping is done in di.xml configuration files with a preference node. Whenever I create an interface and an implementation as part of a Magento module, I try to directly add the preference configuration too, because otherwise it's easy to forget and it just saves time later when I run into this error that an interface can't be instantiated.